To understand the monster, you must first understand the cage he was raised in. Before Caligula was an emperor, before he was a self-proclaimed god, he was a survivor. His education in cruelty began not in a Roman palace, but on an island prison of breathtaking depravity, Capri. This was the personal kingdom of the aging Emperor Tiberius, a place that has been called a university of paranoia, a gilded laboratory where the absolute limits of human wickedness were tested daily. And young Gaius, the boy who would become Caligula, had a front-row seat. Imagine Capri not as a sun-drenched paradise, but as an island of whispers, a fortress of fear where the emperor, twisted by decades of political betrayal and personal loss, had retreated from the world. Here, Tiberius governed the largest empire on earth through a network of spies, informants, and executioners. Every conversation was a potential death sentence. Every friendship was a liability. From his clifftop villas, he didn't just rule. He brooded, indulging in suspicions that curdled into brutal certainties. Men were summoned to Capri on charges of treason so flimsy they were transparent, only to be tortured and hurled from the cliffs into the sea below, where a squadron of sailors waited with oars and boat hooks to smash their bones and ensure no one survived the fall. This was the air Caligula breathed. It was a daily lesson in the grammar of terror, taught by the most powerful man in the world. He was a child surrounded by ghosts. His father, the beloved General Germanicus, had died under suspicious circumstances, likely poisoned on the orders of Tiberius. His mother, Agrippina, and his two older brothers were systematically arrested, exiled, and starved to death by the same paranoid regime. Caligula, the last surviving male of his immediate family, was spared not out of mercy, but out of a twisted sense of political necessity. He was brought to Capri at the age of 19 to live under the direct supervision of the man who had annihilated his entire family. He wasn't a guest. He was a hostage, a living trophy of Tiberius's complete victory over his rivals. According to the historian Suetonius, Caligula survived this psychological crucible by becoming the perfect actor. He understood that to show any sign of resentment, any lingering affection for his dead family, would be to sign his own death warrant. So he suppressed everything. He hid his grief behind a mask of cheerful obedience. He learned to smile at the emperor's cruelest jokes, to applaud his most depraved entertainments, to become a mirror reflecting whatever the paranoid old man wished to see. It was on Capri that he mastered the art of psychological manipulation, learning to wear a personality like a cloak. But beneath this mask of subservience, historians believe something was hardening. He was learning a terrifying lesson, one that would form the bedrock of his own reign. In a world of absolute power, morality is a fiction, and survival belongs to the one who best feigns humanity while shedding his own. And the depravity wasn't merely political. Tiberius had transformed Capri into a theater of perversion. He assembled groups of young men and women, known as the spintriae, to perform elaborate sexual tableaux for his amusement. He had pools constructed for depraved games and orgies. For a young man like Caligula, who was forced to not only witness but participate in these activities, the lines between power, pleasure, and cruelty became irrevocably blurred. He saw firsthand that the man who commanded the legions, the man who held the lives of millions in his hands, was also a predator who used sexual humiliation as a form of entertainment and control. The lesson was clear. Absolute power meant the absolute right to indulge any impulse, no matter how monstrous. So when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, and the news reached Rome that Caligula, the last son of the beloved Germanicus, was to be the new emperor, the reaction was not fear. It was an explosion of pure, unadulterated joy. The Roman people were sick of the grim, paranoid twilight of Tiberius's reign. They saw in Caligula a new dawn. He was young, handsome, and the son of their greatest hero. They poured into the streets, lighting bonfires, offering sacrifices and chanting his name. Suetonius writes that over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in the first 3 months of his reign as a sign of public celebration. They didn't call him Gaius. They called him by his childhood nickname, Caligula, which meant little boot, a name given to him by his father's soldiers when he was a toddler mascot toddling around their camps in a miniature uniform. It was a name dripping with affection, with hope. They believed the son of Germanicus would restore the glory and honor of Rome. They thought they were crowning a hero. They had no idea they were liberating a monster from his cage. And for a few months, it seemed their hopes were justified. Caligula began his reign with acts of calculated generosity. He paid the legacies left by Tiberius, which the old emperor had withheld. He recalled exiles, burned the records of the treason trials, and put on lavish gladiatorial games for the public. He appeared to be everything Tiberius was not: open, magnanimous, and in love with his people. The Senate lavished him with honors. The people adored him. For a brief, shining moment, the Roman world was euphoric. They believed the nightmare was over. But the nightmare was only just beginning. In October of 37 AD, just 8 months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. The nature of this illness is one of history's great dark mysteries. The official accounts simply state it was a brain fever. But what did that mean? For weeks, the entire empire held its breath. The joyous celebrations turned into desperate public prayers. The people who had so recently welcomed him with open arms now stood vigil, weeping in the streets, fearing their newfound hope would be snatched away. Then word came, the emperor was recovering. A wave of relief washed over the empire. But the man who recovered was not the same man who had fallen ill. Something had broken loose inside his skull. The cheerful mask he had worn for years had been burned away by the fever, and what was left was something raw, unfiltered, and terrifying. Historians and medical experts have debated for centuries what truly happened. Was it encephalitis, a swelling of the brain that could have caused permanent neurological damage, stripping away his impulse control and amplifying his latent paranoia? Was it a form of epilepsy, which some ancient Romans associated with divine visions and madness? Or was it simply a profound nervous breakdown? The psychological pressure of surviving Capri, combined with the sudden, crushing weight of absolute power, may have simply shattered a mind that was already fractured. Whatever its biological cause, its psychological effect was absolute. Caligula emerged from his sickbed with a new, terrifying conviction. He seemed to believe that he had not merely survived an illness, he had conquered death itself. And a being who could conquer death was no mere mortal. He was a god. This was the turning point. This was the moment the political actor died and the divine tyrant was born. His subsequent actions were no longer constrained by even the pretense of Roman tradition or human decency. He had transcended them. His first acts were to solidify this new reality. He began to insist on being treated not as princeps or first citizen, like his predecessors, but as deus, a god. He built temples to himself. He replaced the heads of statues of revered gods like Jupiter with his own likeness. He would appear in public dressed as various deities, sometimes as Hercules, sometimes as Apollo, sometimes as Venus. This was not just a case of staggering ego, it was a brilliant and diabolical political strategy. A Roman emperor, as a first citizen, was still technically bound by the laws and traditions of the Senate. But a god? A god is the source of law. A god cannot be questioned or judged or held to any mortal standard. By declaring himself a deity, Caligula was performing a kind of political alchemy. He was attempting to transform the very nature of his power, elevating it from a political office into a divine right. He was building the ideological foundation for the horrors to come, ensuring that no earthly authority could ever hold him accountable for the depravities he was about to unleash. The crucible of Capri had forged his armor. The fever had shattered his mind. And now, reborn as a living god, he was ready to remake the Roman world in his own monstrous image. With his divinity established in his own mind, Caligula needed a stage to perform his new role. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill was no longer to be the center of Roman government. It was to become a theater of humiliation, with the emperor as its sole writer, director, and star. The audience and the unwilling actors were to be the Roman elite, the senators and knights whose families had built the republic and whose ancestors had conquered the world. Caligula understood a profound and terrible truth about power. To truly control a man, it is not enough to threaten his life. You must annihilate his dignity. And for a Roman nobleman, dignity, dignitas, was everything. It was rooted in his public reputation, his military honors, and above all, the sanctity and purity of his family line. It was this foundation of the Roman soul that Caligula set out to systematically demolish, and his chosen weapon was the most intimate and violating tool of all: sex. His first and most infamous creation was the imperial brothel. This was not a rumor or a wild accusation. It is a horror detailed with cold precision by the historian Suetonius. Caligula set aside a wing of his own palace, furnished it lavishly, and opened it for business as a high-class bordello. But this was no ordinary enterprise. The courtesans who were forced to staff this establishment were not common prostitutes. They were the wives and daughters of the most powerful men in Rome. The clientele, their peers, other senators, other knights, anyone with enough money to pay the exorbitant fees. Caligula, the divine emperor, had become the imperial pimp, and the honor of the Roman aristocracy was his primary commodity. Let us be clear, this was not a desperate scheme for raising funds, as some have superficially suggested. The revenue generated was trivial compared to the imperial treasury. This was an act of calculated psychological terrorism. It was a ceremony of degradation on an industrial scale. Imagine the scene. A senator receives a summons to the palace. He arrives to find a section of the emperor's home transformed into a den of vice. And there, on display, is the wife of his colleague, or perhaps even his own daughter. He is then expected not to recoil in horror, but to participate, to place his wagers, to mingle and converse as if this were the most normal social gathering in the world. The act itself was monstrous, but the true genius of its cruelty lay in the enforced complicity. Caligula's heralds were sent throughout the city, publicly inviting men of all ages to come and enjoy themselves. The invitations were commands in disguise. To refuse the emperor's hospitality was treason. To attend was to become a participant in the systematic defilement of your own class. Every man who paid at the door, every man who walked those halls, became an accomplice. Caligula had ingeniously created a system where the victims were forced to victimize each other, shattering the bonds of trust and mutual respect that held the Roman elite together. He atomized them, isolating each man in his own private hell of shame and silence. How could you look your fellow senator in the eye the next morning, knowing you had seen his wife in the imperial brothel? How could you maintain your own sense of honor, knowing you had walked past her, perhaps even bid for her services? It was a psychological vivisection, expertly designed to sever the Roman nobleman from his own identity. But the brothel was merely the public stage. Caligula reserved his most intimate and refined cruelties for his private dinner parties. These banquets became legendary in Rome for their lavishness and for the palpable sense of dread that hung in the air amidst the fine food and wine. The most powerful men of the empire would be reclining on their couches, their wives beside them, all forced into a state of terrified sycophancy. According to both Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caligula would often rise from his own couch during the meal and begin a slow, deliberate walk behind the reclining guests. He wasn't conversing, he was inspecting. He would pause behind the wives of his guests, examining them like a connoisseur of art or a judge of livestock. He would run a hand over their hair, lift their chins to get a better look at their faces, sometimes making them stand up so he could scrutinize their bodies, publicly commenting on their flaws or their attributes as their husbands watched, frozen in a rictus of a smile. Then came the moment of selection. The emperor's gaze would settle on one woman. Without a word to the husband, he would lead her from the dining hall to his private chambers. The party would continue. The husband was expected to remain, to continue eating, to make small talk, to pretend that the most profound humiliation a Roman man could endure was not happening to him in real time. The minutes would stretch into an eternity, every second a fresh turn of the psychological knife. Finally, Caligula would return to the banquet hall, the chosen wife in tow, her face a mask of shame. And then, the final act of this sadistic play. The emperor would proceed to give a loud, detailed critique of the woman's performance in bed, discussing her timidities or her skills, her bodily imperfections or her hidden talents, all in front of her husband and all their peers. And the husband? He was expected to applaud the emperor's review, to thank him for the honor, to praise the very qualities his wife had just been forced to display. This was not the act of a man simply driven by lust. A man driven by lust takes what he wants in secret. This was the act of a political predator who understood that power is not merely the ability to command, but the ability to redefine reality for your victims. By forcing the husband to applaud his own dishonor, Caligula was breaking his spirit. He was compelling the man to become an active participant in his own emasculation, to verbally validate the destruction of his family's honor. It was a psychological checkmate from which there was no recovery. These sexual ceremonies were inextricably linked to Caligula's new religion of the self. The two were mutually reinforcing expressions of his absolute power. While he was desecrating the families of the senators by night, by day he was forcing them to worship him as a living god. He established a priesthood in his own honor, and its first members were the most senior and respected men of the state. These were men whose ancestors had commanded armies, forced to offer sacrifices of flamingos and peacocks to Caligula. They were made to kiss his feet, to prostrate themselves before him, to offer him fawning prayers. This forced worship was the other blade of the scissors, cutting away at their dignity from a different direction. It created an unbearable cognitive dissonance. How can you maintain your sense of self-worth when you are compelled to worship as a god the very man who treats your wife as his personal property? The only way to resolve this psychological paradox, the only way to survive without going insane, was to submit completely. To accept the new reality that Caligula had crafted. He was a god, and therefore his actions were beyond mortal judgment. The concepts of honor, family, and tradition were obsolete. The only virtue was obedience. The only reality was the emperor's whim. Through the twin rituals of sexual degradation and forced worship, Caligula was not merely ruling the Roman elite, he was unmaking them, dissolving their identities until nothing was left but fear and submission. As Caligula's reign descended further into its own deranged logic, his methods of psychological torment became more baroque, more symbolic, and breathtakingly creative. He was no longer content with merely breaking the will of the Roman elite. He began to stage elaborate, perverse satires of Roman institutions themselves. His goal was to demonstrate that every pillar of their society, family, religion, even the state, was a meaningless farce in the face of his divine will. He became a performance artist of terror, and his preferred medium was the ritualistic desecration of everything his subjects held sacred. The most profound of these rituals was his relationship with his favorite sister, Drusilla. Incest was a supreme taboo in Roman society, a pollution of the bloodline that invited divine wrath. For Caligula, this made it the perfect instrument of his self-deification. According to the accounts of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, he began to live openly with Drusilla as his wife. He did not hide their relationship. He flaunted it, seating her beside him at public banquets in the place traditionally reserved for an empress, showing her the affection and reverence due to a spouse. This was not a private vice, it was a public declaration. It was a calculated act of theological politics. In one stroke, Caligula was achieving two things. First, he was elevating himself and his family to a status beyond humanity. Who, in the Roman imagination, married their siblings? The gods. Jupiter and Juno, the king and queen of the pantheon, were brother and sister. By mirroring their divine union, Caligula was providing living proof of his own godhood. He was no longer bound by the pathetic mortal conventions that governed lesser men. He was embodying a divine archetype, demonstrating a power over social norms that was absolute. Second, he was spitting in the face of Roman tradition. Every time a senator bowed to the imperial couple, he was being forced to acknowledge and legitimize an act he knew to be a profound perversion of Roman values. It was an act of mass psychological conditioning, forcing the ruling class to accept a reality that was, by their own standards, insane. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD, Caligula's reaction was a spectacle of grief so extreme it bordered on the surreal. He plunged the entire empire into a period of official mourning. To laugh, to bathe, to dine with one's family were declared capital offenses. He had her deified, making her the first woman in Roman history to be officially declared a goddess. He would swear oaths by her name and demand that the Roman people worship her as Diva Drusilla. On the surface, it may have looked like the heartbroken ravings of a grieving brother. But underneath it was the ultimate power play. He had transformed his incestuous partner into a god, and now commanded the Roman state to ratify his personal desires as celestial truth. He had taken his most profound transgression and literally carved it into the religious fabric of the empire. Having successfully satirized the institutions of family and religion, Caligula turned his attention to the very heart of Roman political life, the Senate and the consulate. And for this, he chose an instrument of ridicule so absurd, so perfectly insulting, that it has echoed through history as a byword for madness: his horse, incitatus. The story, as it has been popularly told, is that Caligula, in a fit of insanity, literally planned to make his horse a consul, the highest elected official in Rome. But to dismiss this as mere madness is to miss the terrifying genius of its cruelty. Most modern historians believe Caligula was not truly insane in this act, but was engaging in a piece of political theater so contemptuous it was breathtaking. It was a living, breathing metaphor for his opinion of the Senate. He was communicating a message of pure disdain. This animal, this creature of brute instinct that carries me on its back and defecates in the street, is more worthy of high office than any of you. He showered Incitatus with honors that would have been the lifelong ambition of any Roman nobleman. The horse had a stable made of marble, a manger of ivory, and was fed oats mixed with flakes of gold. He was adorned with a collar of precious jewels and blankets of royal purple. But the true ritual of humiliation involved the senators themselves. According to Cassius Dio, high-ranking officials were commanded to visit the horse's stable to pay their respects before undertaking any important business. Even more surreal, they were invited to dine with the horse. Priests of Caligula's cult would host lavish banquets in Incitatus's name, where the animal would be the guest of honor, and the most powerful men in Rome would be forced to recline and make toasts to its health. Imagine the psychological state of a senator forced to attend such an event. He has spent his entire life in the ruthless world of Roman politics, scheming, fighting, perhaps even killing, to reach the pinnacle of power. And now he is compelled to sit in a stable, sipping the finest wine and paying homage to a horse. It is a moment of perfect, soul-crushing absurdity. It is an exercise in power so complete that it can compel its subjects to participate in the most ridiculous, self-negating acts. Caligula was demonstrating, in the most visceral way possible, that their titles, their ambitions, and their dignity were utterly worthless. He could elevate a horse above them, and they were so powerless, so trapped, that their only option was to play along. But perhaps the most refined and intimate form of psychological torture Caligula devised was a ritual of forced confession. According to Seneca, a contemporary who loathed the emperor, Caligula would sometimes employ a terrifying form of after-dinner entertainment. After having taken a senator's wife to his chambers, and after having publicly critiqued her performance, he would later compel the senator himself to stand before the court and recount, in his own words and in meticulous detail, the affair his wife had been forced to have with the emperor. This is a level of cruelty that transcends physical violence. It is the ultimate act of psychological domination. The victim is no longer a passive recipient of abuse. He is forced to become the narrator of his own shame. He must adopt the emperor's perspective, verbalize the act of his own dishonor, and perform his humiliation for the amusement of his peers. This act completes the destruction of the self. It erases the last bastion of inner resistance, forcing the man's own voice to become an instrument of his tormentor. By making them tell the story, Caligula was making them own their degradation. He was turning them into willing collaborators in the demolition of their own honor, ensuring that the shame was not just something inflicted upon them, but something they had actively participated in creating. It was the final, horrifying flourish of a master who had learned his craft in the paranoid hell of Capri. True power is not just the ability to kill a man, but the ability to make him wish he had never been born. A reign built on the systematic annihilation of dignity cannot last. It creates a political environment so toxic, so saturated with fear and resentment, that it must eventually implode. For 4 years, the Roman elite had endured Caligula's escalating horrors. They had prostituted their families, worshipped their tormentor as a god, and paid homage to his horse. They had swallowed humiliation after humiliation, playing their parts in his grotesque theater, because the alternative was a swift and brutal death. But absolute power, when wielded with such relentless psychological cruelty, has a flaw. It eventually pushes men past the point of fear and into a realm of pure, nihilistic desperation. When a man has nothing left to lose, not his life, not his property, and certainly not his honor, he becomes singularly dangerous. By the beginning of 41 AD, Caligula had created a ruling class of such men. The conspiracy that finally ended his life was not a noble plot to restore the Republic, nor was it born from a single righteous grievance. It was an act of collective self-preservation, a desperate lashing out by men who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The final catalyst was, fittingly, an insult. Caligula had taken to taunting Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer in his own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor's life. Chaerea was a veteran soldier, a man of pride, but he had a high-pitched voice. Caligula found this endlessly amusing. He would mock Chaerea in public, calling him feminine, and would give him obscene passwords like Priapus or Venus to humiliate him in front of his own men. For a soldier, this public emasculation was a fate worse than death. The emperor was not just insulting the man, he was dissolving the very authority and respect upon which his life depended. Chaerea decided that either his own honor or the emperor's life had to end. He did not have to look far for allies. He found them among other Praetorian officers whom Caligula had threatened, and among senators who had suffered the most intimate degradations. The plot culminated on January 24th, 41 A.D., during a series of games held on the Palatine Hill. As Caligula was walking through a private corridor beneath the palace, heading back from the theater, the conspirators cornered him. Chaerea struck the first blow. The others, a mix of guardsmen and senators, descended upon him in a frenzy of pent-up rage. They were not just killing an emperor, they were exorcising a demon. According to Suetonius, he was stabbed over 30 times, with some of his killers reportedly shouting, "Strike again!" as they vented years of fury and shame onto his body. The violence was primal, a direct and bloody reaction to the psychological violence he had inflicted upon them for so long. The men he had tried to unmake as men had finally responded with the most masculine act of all, righteous, brutal violence. The news of his death sparked a brief, chaotic attempt by the Senate to restore the Republic. It was a futile gesture. 4 years under Caligula had broken them too thoroughly. While they debated, the Praetorian Guard, fearing for their own futures, found Caligula's terrified, stammering uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. They hailed him as the new emperor, and the Senate, leaderless and spiritually broken, had no choice but to acquiesce. The age of emperors would continue, but the death of the man was not the death of the problem he represented. The Senate, in a final act of defiance against their tormentor, immediately declared a Damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. This was an official Roman process for dealing with tyrants and traitors. His name was to be erased from all public inscriptions. His statues were to be torn down and destroyed. Coins bearing his image were to be melted down. The goal was to expunge him from history, to make it as if the nightmare of his reign had never happened. Ironically, this very act of erasure is what helped create the monstrous legend of Caligula that we know today. The Damnatio memoriae created a historical vacuum. With the official record sanitized, the story of his reign fell to historians and writers who came after him, men like Suetonius and Tacitus, who were writing under the patronage of new imperial dynasties. These writers had a vested interest in portraying the emperors of the preceding Julio-Claudian line as decadent, insane, and monstrous. It served to legitimize the new rulers and make them seem like saviors by comparison. They took the whispers, the rumors, and the genuine horrors of Caligula's reign and amplified them, filling the vacuum with the most sensational and depraved stories imaginable. This raises the most crucial and difficult question for any student of this history. How much of it is true? Can we really believe a man made his horse a consul? Did he truly operate a brothel in his own palace? Or are these the lurid fictions of hostile propagandists? The scholarly consensus is that while the details may have been exaggerated for dramatic effect, The essential truth of Caligula's reign is undeniable. The smoke of these outrageous stories must have come from a very real and very terrible fire. We may never know if he literally forced a senator to narrate his own wife's affair, but we know, from multiple sources, that he held the power of life and death over the Senate and treated them with open contempt. We may never know if he truly believed he was Jupiter, but we know he demanded and received divine honors. The historical truth of Caligula does not lie in verifying every single lurid anecdote. It lies in recognizing the undeniable pattern of behavior, a systematic campaign of psychological terror, using public and sexual humiliation as a primary weapon to consolidate absolute power. The specifics of the stories are less important than the political and psychological reality they reflect. He may not have done everything the historians accused him of, but he was certainly monstrous enough to make those accusations believable to his contemporaries. And that, in itself, is a verdict. The true legacy of Caligula, then, is not the memory of a madman. It is the terrifying discovery of a political formula. He was a pioneer in the field of psychological warfare, a man who realized that you could control a powerful elite more effectively by destroying their souls than by taking their lives. He demonstrated that fear is a powerful tool, but shame is a perfect one. He created a blueprint for tyranny that relied on the ritualistic destruction of human dignity, a dark legacy that would echo throughout the reigns of later Roman emperors like Nero and Domitian, and would be rediscovered time and again by the most monstrous autocrats of the modern world. He had shown them the way. The horror of Caligula is not that he was an anomaly, it is that he was a prototype. So we return to our central question. Was Caligula a madman, or was he a monstrously lucid political operator? The historical record suggests the answer is not one or the other. It is both. He was a broken man, forged in the paranoid furnace of Capri and likely shattered by illness, who was then handed the terrifying gift of absolute power. And in that brokenness he found a terrible kind of genius. He did not simply descend into a chaotic madness. He weaponized it. He took his own pathologies, his paranoia, his narcissism, his utter lack of empathy, and fashioned them into a sophisticated system of control. His reign was the perfect, horrifying synthesis of a deranged mind and an unlimited opportunity to express its derangement. He did not simply rule Rome. He held a mirror up to the face of the Roman power structure and forced it to gaze upon its own grotesque reflection. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the fragile foundations upon which the honor of the Roman elite was built. He saw their hypocrisy, their ambition, and their fear, and he played upon these weaknesses with the skill of a virtuoso. The sexual ceremonies, the deification of his sister, the elevation of his horse, these were not random acts of insanity. They were calculated assaults on the very concepts of family, faith, and state. He ruled by demonstrating, day after day, that nothing was sacred. And in a world where nothing is sacred, there is only one reality, the absolute, unquestionable will of the emperor. The story of Caligula is more than a lurid footnote in the annals of history. It is a case study in the pathology of power. It reveals a terrifying truth about the human condition. Absolute authority does not just corrupt, it reveals. It strips away the thin veneer of socialization, of custom, of law, and shows the monstrous potential that can lurk within the human psyche. Caligula was a man who was granted the permission to act out his darkest impulses on the world's grandest stage, and the result was a reign so profoundly cruel that its memory still has the power to shock us 2 millennia later. He created a handbook for psychological tyranny, demonstrating that the most effective way to dominate a person is not to break their body, but to force them to participate in the breaking of their own spirit. His legacy is a cold and enduring warning that echoes through the corridors of history, a warning whispered every time a leader demands not just obedience, but adulation. Every time they seek to humiliate their rivals rather than simply defeat them. Every time they blur the lines between the state and their own personal desires. The horror of Caligula is not that a man like him once existed. The horror is that the conditions that created him, unquestioning power, a culture of sycophancy, and the desperation of a populace, have never truly vanished. History teaches us that monsters are not born, they are made. They are made by the systems we build and the power we grant. So the final question is not for him, but for us. Caligula's story serves as a chilling reminder that the line between civilization and barbarism is perilously thin. When a single individual is allowed to become a god, they often choose to become a devil instead. The question is not whether another Caligula will appear on the world stage. The question is, when he does, will we have the courage to recognize him before it's too late? If you have the stomach to continue exploring the darkest psychological profiles in history, subscribe to our channel. Comment below and let us know which historical monster's mind you want us to dissect next. And remember, history is not just the study of the past, it is a warning for the future.